The elevator doors opened on the 7th floor, but the building only had 6 floors. Emma Fisher stood frozen in the metal box, her breath forming small clouds in the suddenly cold air as she stared at the impossible corridor stretching before her. A place that shouldn't exist, decorated with crumbling concrete walls and flickering fluorescent lights that seemed to come from another era entirely. It was March 2022 in Berlin, Germany, and Emma, a 29-year-old graphic designer, had just moved into what seemed like a perfectly normal modern apartment building in the Kreuzberg district 8 months after its grand opening, a gleaming glass facade structure that stood proud among the renovated warehouses and trendy cafes that lined the street. But something was wrong with this building, something that Emma would discover slowly over the coming weeks, starting with the way her elderly neighbor Frau Weber refused to use the elevator, always taking the stairs despite her bad knees, or how the building superintendent would change the subject whenever anyone mentioned the construction history. Emma had first noticed the anomaly 3 days after moving in when she examined the elevator panel closely during a late-night ride home from work and saw a suspicious gap in the button arrangement, a space where something had clearly been removed. And when she looked closer, she could make out the faint scratches of a number 7 that had been scraped away, though not quite carefully enough to hide completely. That night, she couldn't sleep, tossing and turning as she thought about the missing button. And the next morning, she did what any curious person in the digital age would do. She Googled the building's history. What Emma found in the local news archives made her blood run cold. Tragedy at New Kreuzberg project, architect Stefan Hoffmann found dead in his studio 1 week before building opening. Read the headline from October 2021, and buried in the comment section of the article, an anonymous user had written, "Does anyone know about the 7th floor? Why did the plans change?" Emma spent the entire weekend researching, finding construction photos that clearly showed a 7-story structure being built, only to discover that the final building mysteriously had only 6 floors, with no official explanation for the change. She went down to the basement parking garage on Sunday evening, ostensibly to check her car, but really to investigate. And as she stood there looking up at the ceiling, she noticed that the pipes and electrical conduits didn't make sense, running upward in directions that suggested they were feeding something above the 6th floor, something that officially didn't exist. The following Friday night at 2:47 a.m., Emma found herself unable to sleep again, deciding to take out the trash, and when the elevator arrived, its ceiling light was out, leaving only the dim emergency lighting that cast everything in an eerie green glow. She stepped inside, garbage bag in hand, and found herself staring at that scratched-away number 7, and before she could stop herself, before rational thought could intervene, she pressed her finger firmly against the spot and held it there for a long moment. The elevator began to shake, subtle at first but building in intensity, and the panel lights flickered in a rhythm that seemed almost like Morse code, and then impossibly, wonderfully, terrifyingly, a new button materialized under her finger, glowing with phosphorescent green light. The number 7, as clear as day. Emma's heart hammered in her chest as she faced a choice that would change everything. Press it or get out now while she still could, return to her apartment and pretend this never happened. Go back to her normal life of design projects and weekend brunches and dating apps. But curiosity, that fundamental human drive that has led to both our greatest discoveries and our worst mistakes, won out, and her finger pressed the glowing button before her conscious mind could interfere. The elevator lurched upward, passing floor 1 with its soft ding, then 2, 3, for where her own apartment sat in ignorant bliss, 5, 6, and then instead of stopping, instead of refusing to go further as logic and physics demanded, it continued climbing to 7 that the doors opened with a mechanical wheeze that sounded like the building itself was breathing, revealing a corridor that couldn't exist, a space that belonged to a different time, with exposed concrete walls covered in water, stains and graffiti in German that Emma's limited language skills couldn't quite translate, and fluorescent tubes that buzzed and flickered with an irregular rhythm that made her eyes hurt. There was only one door in this impossible hallway, a heavy metal barrier painted industrial yellow, marked with a faded radiation warning symbol that made Emma's skin crawl, and she knew with absolute certainty that she should get back in the elevator right now and leave. But she didn't. She stepped out onto the 7th floor, and the elevator doors closed behind her with a finality that sounded like a coffin lid slamming shut. And suddenly Emma was alone in a place that didn't exist, in a part of a building that had been erased from official records. And the only sound was that incessant buzzing of the lights and a low mechanical hum coming from behind the yellow door. She approached slowly, each step echoing in the empty corridor. And when she pressed her ear against the cold metal, she could hear it more clearly. Machinery, old machinery, the kind of sound that belonged in a factory or laboratory from decades past. The door handle turned easily, which somehow made it worse because it meant someone had been here. Someone had used this door maybe recently, maybe today. And when Emma pushed it open, she stepped into what looked like a scene from a Cold War thriller. The room was enormous, much larger than should have been possible given the building's dimensions, filled with equipment that belonged in a museum. Massive computers with reel-to-reel tape drives, oscilloscopes with round green screens, tangles of wires and cables connecting machines whose purposes Emma couldn't begin to guess. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, undisturbed except for a clear pathway from the door to a desk in the center of the room. A path that showed someone had walked here recently. Someone who knew exactly where they were going. On the desk sat a notebook, and Emma's hands trembled as she opened it to find handwritten entries in German. Dated entries that made her question her sanity. 15 Mars 1977. Test 23 Erfolgreich. Haben 3.7 Sekunden erreicht. March 15, 1977. Test 23 successful. We have achieved 3.7 seconds. And then April 8, 1977. Test 31 Feller. Mahler ist verschwunden. April 8, 1977. Test 31 error. Muller has disappeared. And finally April 20th, 1977. Project geschlossen. Versiegeln C Edge 7-inch. April 20th, 1977. Project closed. Seal floor 7. But it was the last page that made Emma's vision blur and her knees weak because it was written in fresh ink, dated 2022. And it said in clear German that she could translate. When du das liest, Emma Fischer. Dan hat es funktioniert. Ich bin Stefan Hoffmann. Ich bin im Jahr 1977 gefangen. Bitte hilf mir. If you're reading this, Emma Fischer, then it worked. I am Stefan Hoffmann. I am trapped in the year 1977. Please help me. Emma dropped the notebook, backing away as her mind tried to process the impossible. Because Stefan Hoffmann was the architect who had designed this building, the man who had died by suicide in 2021. But how could he have written a note to her specifically, using her name? Unless he had known she would come here, unless time itself was broken in this place. The sound of the elevator jolted her back to reality, and Emma spun around to see the doors closing, the elevator descending without her, leaving her trapped on the 7th floor that didn't exist. And she ran to the corridor, pounding on the closed elevator doors, screaming for help that wouldn't come because no one knew this floor was here. No one except whoever had sealed it in 1977. She was trapped, just like Mahler, just like Stefan Hoffmann, caught in some kind of temporal anomaly that she didn't understand. And her phone showed no signal, not even emergency calls. And the laboratory behind her hummed with ancient machinery that somehow still had power after all these decades. Emma forced herself to calm down, to think like the designer she was, to look for solutions rather than panic. And she went back into the laboratory to search for anything that might help. A phone, a radio, another way out. That's when she found it, sitting on a shelf behind one of the old computers. A ham radio, dusty, but intact. And when she flipped the power switch, it crackled to life with surprising vigor, as if it had been waiting all these years for someone to use it. She picked up the microphone, her hands shaking, and spoke into it. Hello? Can anyone hear me? This is Emma Fischer. I'm trapped in a building in Berlin. I need help. Static filled the room. White noise that seemed to go on forever. And Emma was about to give up when a voice emerged from the speakers. Distant and distorted, but unmistakably human. Emma? Emma Fischer? Kannst du Michigan hören? Can you hear me? The voice continued in accented English. Emma, this is Stefan. I am on floor 7. But in 1977. Emma's grip on the microphone tightened until her knuckles turned white, and she forced words through her constricted throat. That's impossible. Stefan Hoffmann died in 2021. You can't be in 1977. The voice on the radio laughed, a bitter sound that held no humor. Time is not what you think, Emma. This floor, this laboratory, it was built to study temporal displacement. We succeeded, but we couldn't control it. Some of us got scattered through time, trapped in different years, but all occupying the same space. The 7th floor. I've been trying to send messages forward, to warn people, to find someone who could help. Emma sank into a chair, her legs no longer able to support her weight, as Stefan's voice continued to explain the impossible. The seventh floor existed outside normal time, a pocket dimension that connected multiple temporal points, accessible only to those who knew how to activate the elevator button. And anyone who stayed too long risked becoming unstuck in time themselves, scattered across decades like Stefan and Mahler and others whose names had been forgotten. "How do I get out?" Emma whispered, and Stefan's response came after a long pause. "The elevator should return. It cycles through every few hours. But Emma, you need to know something. I didn't bring you here by accident. I've been leaving clues, guiding people to this floor for years. Try to find someone who could understand the equipment, someone who could repair the temporal stabilizer and free us. You're a designer. You understand systems. You can see patterns. You can help us." Emma looked around at the incomprehensible machines, a technology that was 40 years old and 50 years beyond her understanding. And she wanted to say no, wanted to tell Stefan that he had the wrong person, that she couldn't possibly figure out this nightmare of wires and equations. But before she could speak, the lights flickered, and she felt it, a strange sensation like reality was skipping, like frames being dropped from film, and suddenly she wasn't alone in the laboratory anymore. Translucent figures stood among the machines, ghostly and indistinct, and Emma realized she was seeing them, the others, the people who had been trapped in different time periods, all occupying the seventh floor simultaneously, and they were all looking at her with desperate hope in their eyes. Stefan's voice came through the radio again. "You're seeing them now, aren't you? That means the temporal walls are thinning. We don't have much time. Emma, please, there's a device on the main console labeled Zeitstabilisator. If you can activate it, if you can set it to the right frequency, it might synchronize all of us back to the present, free us from this trap." Emma stood on shaking legs and approached the main console, where a device sat beneath a labeled panel, its dials and switches meaningless to her untrained eyes. And she realized that Stefan wasn't asking her to understand the science. He was asking her to trust, to try, to be brave enough to manipulate forces she couldn't comprehend in hopes of saving people who had been suffering for decades. She placed her hands on the controls, and as she did, she felt the presence of the others, felt their collective consciousness pressing against her awareness, guiding her hands, showing her which switches to flip, which dials to turn, and Emma understood that this is why she had been chosen, not for her knowledge, but for her willingness to trust, to act, to believe in the impossible. The machine began to hum, building in intensity until the whole floor shook, and the ghostly figures became more solid, more real, as time itself seemed to bend and flex around them. And Emma saw Stefan Hoffman materialize completely, a middle-aged man in 1970s clothing with tears streaming down his face. And behind him others appeared, dozens of them, people from different eras, all suddenly existing in the same moment. The elevator dinged, its doors opening, and Stefan grabbed Emma's hand. "Run, now, before the synchronization completes." They ran together, Emma and Stefan and all the others who had been trapped, piling into an elevator that shouldn't have been able to hold them all. And as the doors closed, Emma saw the laboratory beginning to collapse, reality reasserting itself, erasing the impossible seventh floor from existence. The elevator descended, and with each floor it passed, more of the ghostly figures faded away, dispersing to their proper times, until only Emma and Stefan remained. And when the doors opened on the ground floor, they stumbled out into the lobby of Emma's building at 3:17 a.m. on a Friday night in March 2022. Stefan looked around in wonder at the modern design, at the world that had continued without him for 45 years. And he turned to Emma with gratitude and terror in equal measure. "I'm in 2022. I've been trapped since 1977. My family, my friends, everyone I knew, they must all be..." Emma put a hand on his arm, not knowing what to say, how to comfort a man who had just lost everything he had ever known. And she realized that saving him had created a new problem. How do you explain to the authorities that you've rescued a man who died over a year ago, who officially killed himself but was actually trapped in a temporal anomaly? They stood there in the empty lobby, two people bound by an impossible experience, and Stefan whispered, "There's something I need to tell you, something about why I created this building, why I hid the seventh floor, the temporal research in 1977. It wasn't just an accident. We were trying to create a stable time corridor, a way to send messages or even people through time. We succeeded, but something went wrong, and the floor became a trap instead of a gateway. I designed this building on this exact spot because I knew the anomaly would still be here, waiting. I left clues in the architecture, in the elevator design, hoping someone would find it, would find me, and you did. Emma's mind reeled as she processed the implications. Stefan had designed his own building decades after he got trapped, had somehow influenced events from within the temporal anomaly, had orchestrated his own rescue across the span of nearly 50 years, and she had been the one chosen to complete the final step. But before she could ask any of 1,000 questions flooding her mind, Stefan's form began to flicker, becoming translucent again, and he looked down at his hands in horror. No, it's not stable. The synchronization, it's not permanent. I'm being pulled back. Emma grabbed his arm or tried to, but her hands passed through him now as he became more ghost than man. What do I do? How do I fix this? Stefan's voice came from very far away. The notebook in the laboratory, the equations. Find someone who understands temporal physics. Tell them what happened. They'll know what to do. And Emma, thank you for trying. He vanished completely, dispersing like smoke, and Emma was alone in the lobby, with no evidence that any of it had happened except for the notebook she'd grabbed on her way out, clutched in her hands like a lifeline to sanity. She looked up at the building, at its 6 innocent floors that showed no sign of the impossible space hidden between reality and time, and she made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would find those scientists, would share the notebook, would dedicate herself to understanding the temporal anomaly and finding a permanent way to free Stefan and any others who might still be trapped. But for now, as dawn began to break over Berlin, Emma went back to her apartment on the 4th floor, made herself a strong coffee, and sat down at her computer to begin researching quantum physics, temporal mechanics, and the thin places where the past, present, and future blur together. The elevator in the lobby dinged softly, its doors opening on an empty car, and if Emma had been there to see it, she would have noticed that the panel now showed 7 buttons clearly visible, as if they had never been removed at all, waiting for the next curious soul to discover them. And in laboratories around the world, scientists who studied the nature of time received an anonymous email containing scans of a notebook from 1977, filled with equations that would revolutionize their understanding of temporal physics. Equations that suggested time was not a straight line but a web, with certain points where the strands crossed, where the past could touch the present, where the impossible became merely improbable. Stefan Hoffmann watched all of this from his prison in 1977, looking through a window that showed him glimpses of 2022, and he smiled because he knew that Emma would succeed, that she would find the answer, that one day he would step out of that elevator permanently and finally be free, even if it meant emerging into a world where everyone he had ever loved was long gone. Because freedom, even lonely freedom, was better than an eternity trapped between moments. And he waited, as he had been waiting for 45 years, for the day when time would finally let him go.